Since Kirby Smart has gotten things up and running at Georgia, just about no one has done a better job recruiting than he has. The Bulldogs are the only team in the country to sign a top 3 overall class in each of the last 4 recruiting cycles. And that's paid off, elevating the number of blue chip players on Georgia's roster. Heading into the 2020 season, 82% of the players on Georgia's roster were at one point either a 4 or 5-star prospect. The only team in the country that has a higher percentile is Alabama. But it's worth pointing out here that some of the 3-star prospects on Georgia's roster are actually some of their best players in Eric Stokes, Jordan Davis, and Monty Rice. But what does assembling all this blue chip talent really mean? Because as we look at the data, sometimes just because you have over the 50% threshold doesn't necessarily mean you have that much greater of an advantage over some of the teams you play. That 50% number is so important because it's essentially a line of who gets in a national title conversation and who doesn't. As Bud Elliott for 247 Sports so eloquently explains, that's the number of blue chip prospects you need to have to be considered a national title contender. Every team in essentially the modern recruiting era has had at least 50% of its roster assembled of blue chip recruits. Sometimes you don't necessarily need the 80% threshold that Georgia's been working at, as Clemson in recent years has had around 60%, and LSU a season ago had that similar number. COVID-19 figures to be a huge factor during the season, not just because of whether or not we'll have it, but even once we get into it, who might be available on a week-to-week basis. Let's say they run tests on a Friday morning and a player happens to test positive. That means that the last second, a backup is going to have to be ready for a huge game that next day. One other important aspect to note here is sort of the advantage of having all these extra blue chip recruits. Because not all blue chip recruits are obviously created equal. Some of those 4-stars that are ranked lower than 5-star prospects actually end up becoming better players. Joe Burrow is an example of that. He was the best player in the country last year, even if he was just an average 4-star recruit. And if you look at Georgia's schedule, just because they have an 82% blue chip ratio doesn't necessarily mean they have a significant advantage or an easier time against the schedule they have to face. Because they do play 3 teams on the schedule that also have over that 50% threshold. Alabama, who has the number 1 blue chip ratio in the country at 83%, and then Auburn and Florida as well. But then you look at teams like Oklahoma and Clemson, college football playoff contenders that only have to play 1 team on this blue chip ratio 15-team set. Texas plays Oklahoma, and Texas actually has a higher blue chip ratio than the Sooners, but the Sooners have had their fair share of success against the Longhorns in recent seasons. As for Clemson, the only blue chip ratio team they play this year is Notre Dame. Given the way Smart and Georgia have recruited in recent seasons, it does make sense that they would have a significant advantage over some of the college football teams they're playing. And with opponents like Missouri, South Carolina, and Kentucky, that'll eventually bore itself out, which is why the Bulldogs, for the most part, have had a ton of success against those programs. But the blue chip ratio also shows us that Georgia doesn't exactly have the easiest run of it just because they signed so many more blue chip prospects. That's where development really comes in and pays off, because turning 3-star prospects like Jordan Davis into big-time players, and even developing those 4-star prospects into household names like LSU did with Burrow a season ago, ultimately end up making the big difference. Georgia's gotten into the party when it comes to the blue chip ratio national title conversation, but it's still got a lot of work to do to eventually get there and win that national title and eventually end all these 1980 jokes for a while. For Dog Nation, I'm Connor Riley.
For more Dog Nation videos, check out youtube.com/DogNation.